Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar, Employee Activism, Social Media, and Brand Protection. I'm Adria Barich, a Management Associate for Consultants Collective, as well as the editor for Biznology. Today, I'll be moderating the Q&A. Today's webinar is being presented by Jem and our consulting division, Consultants Collective. Following the webinar, a recording will be posted on biznology.com, and I will be sending you all an email after the event with a brief survey and a link to the recordings that Jen McClure, as well as our featured speakers, Consultants Collective members Casey Hall and Douglas Spencer.
Thanks, Adria. Welcome everybody, and thank you so much, Casey and Douglas, for joining us today. I'll introduce our speakers and then kick things over to them. We're just gonna have a discussion today. We'll have some Q&A, we'll have some polling, but before we get started, I wanna introduce you to our two speakers. Casey Hall is the president of Lumberjack Social, which specializes in enterprise social media strategy. Casey works with clients to develop the processes, infrastructure, governance, and vision to build world-class social media programs. In addition, he works directly with the C-suite executives and subject matter experts to empower them to be effective brand ambassadors on social media while increasing their authority, thought leadership, and reach. You also may have heard Casey at conferences. He's a sought-after social media speaker at social media conferences like Social Media Marketing World, Social Shakeup, Adobe Summit, Digital Summit, the Conference Board events, and many others around the globe. Thank you, Casey. Douglas Spencer is the founder and president of Spencer Brenneman, LLC, which helps mission-driven organizations reframe their focus and remaster their messaging to thrive in any environment. Douglas has more than 30 years of branding and marketing experience. He works with professionals from around the world in verticals such as financial and professional services, high tech, higher education, healthcare, and not-for-profits. He's also the author of Do They Care?, which is a question that all brands should be asking themselves all the time in order to make sure that they are relevant to their constituencies. Both Douglas and Casey are members of Consultants Collective, but I've also had the pleasure of working with them in our previous corporate roles, and we've been thinking about and working together on addressing the opportunities, challenges, and risks of employees' use of social media and the idea of employees as brand for a long time. So I'm excited and grateful that Casey and Douglas have agreed to lead this discussion today during a time when this issue is more important than ever, with employee walkouts at large companies, employees demanding more of their companies and CEOs feeling pressured to take more of a public stance on social media, on social issues via social media, and many employees feeling disenfranchised as the result of COVID, either because they are working remotely or they're on the front lines risking their lives and their families, or they've been furloughed or laid off. So there's a lot to unpack here. So let's get started. Casey and Douglas, take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Jen and Adria, and glad to be here with Douglas. So I wanted to get started with a little bit of background for those who haven't been thinking about the way that brands and companies have been communicating over the years to their employees about how they should be using social media. So for a long time, communications teams, to the extent that social media started to become a thing in the early 2000s and 2010s, if companies did have a policy at all, it was a policy of telling employees to never use social media in relation to the business. Don't mention that you work here. Don't talk about what you're doing. This was all seen as significant risk. And that's even if there was a policy, which obviously not all companies have, and not even all companies now have. So I think we have a poll question, Adria. I'd be curious for those who are on the call today, on the webinar today, how many of the companies that you work with or work for have a social media policy for employees? So that's, I think, a really important thing to start with, because it sort of sets the groundwork for everything else that you're able to do in terms of training employees on how to use social media and being able to enforce those policies So anyway, that's where we started with this idea of companies really being, to the extent that they were even doing anything about social media, it was all about risk mitigation, which makes sense. I'm not saying it's wrong, but companies realized that the genie was out of the bottle in some ways, and that the employees were going to be out sharing things. And so we started to have some monitoring in place, but then we started to see it as an opportunity. And that's a lot of the work that I do now, actually, is this idea of employee advocacy, where you train your employees how to properly use social media. And then for the purpose of their own professional development, they get to talk about the work that they do, and that's supported by the business. So that's a brand that says, hey, we have these great engineers, or we have these great attorneys, and we would like you, it would help us to build our brand. It would help you to build your personal professional networks. And seeing that we have, most people don't have an employee social media policy. So if there's one takeaway for you today, get a social media policy. So that sort of started to build up, where employees were now being somewhat empowered by some companies to start being active on social media, not necessarily on behalf of the company. They weren't looked at as spokespeople, but they were looked at as people who could help support the brand. And in more recent years, we've seen, and I'd like to, Douglas has been doing great work with this, seeing more companies have sort of brand activism or corporate activism, where companies are taking really clear stances on a number of issues. You see Patagonia, encouraging people to be aware of the environmental implications of all their decisions. Lots of companies in the last year have become even more vocal about the stances that they take, because in my opinion, silence has become not the great option that it had been for many years. So that kind of gets us to where we are, but now we have a situation where many companies are seeing that this employee voice that maybe they fostered, or maybe that they were trying to mitigate even before that, is not always aligning with their chosen brand and how they'd like to present themselves. In some cases, it may be coming around to bite them themselves, because the company is not maybe living up to the values that it is espousing. So those are some of the issues that I think a lot of companies are dealing with, and hoping that they don't actually have to deal with. But it's one of those things that I think is happening anyway, just like employee social media was happening even before we made it a thing. It's out there. And whether brands like it or not, I think it's time that they have to start thinking about how they address it, support it, respond to it, ignore it. But that needs to be a choice that a company makes, and not just a sort of default position because they haven't done anything else. So I think that's where we are. And Douglas, what this year is obviously different.
Yeah, it's different, all right.
Yeah, what sort of in this climate, as we think about the current state, how is this working with companies and brands, and how their employees are?
Well, I think that to your question about this year and the environment, I think one of the things that happened is everyone is someday.
I'm not sure if I'm frozen or you're frozen, Douglas.
Douglas is frozen.
Okay. So, Douglas, while you come back to where we are here, while we, this year has been incredibly everything for everyone, right? But as we have employers who are now realizing that, maybe employers and brands realizing that it's not as easy as it was maybe a year ago, certainly 3, 4, 5 years ago, to simply stay silent. They have come out and supported causes, whether that's Black Lives Matter, environmental causes. Companies have sort of embraced this sort of employee activism, or not employee activism, but brand activism. And I think that as employees, oftentimes they see that as as an opportunity to align what they're doing more closely with their employers and their brands. So in my mind, having the ability to do those things in a way that is well supported, you can put together the kind of trainings that work, you can put together the sorts of guidance that works, but you can't and shouldn't, in my opinion, simply try to quash employee voices that are out there in social media. So, you know, one of the hypotheticals that Douglas and I had been discussing was the situation in which you have an employee who, hey Douglas. All right.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. What did I miss?
Nothing. I was just talking about the year being one in which I think a lot of brands have decided that they can no longer stay silent, and that sometimes that brand activism may or may not align with the employees' sort of ideas of what activism should look like.
Right. So one of the things that I see happening right now is this big confluence. So we always have this tendency to look at things in a silo. We look at marketing as one thing, branding as another, employee engagement as a third thing, and social media even another thing. And what we're seeing right now is all of those things coming together, because you can't have happy customers if you don't have happy employees. So employee engagement is important. And now you can't attract and retain the best talent if you don't stand for something. The data show very clearly that millennials and others now in the job market would rather take a pay cut than work for a company they don't respect or cannot connect with. And consumers feel exactly the same way. And so now you've got employees that you've got engaged in social media on your behalf because that's good branding. Well, you know, what's branding? Branding is the relationship you have with the people most important to your success. And that begins with employees. So your brand is not only what goes out in the world, it's what goes on inside. And so whenever there's an issue, whenever there's this disconnect, it's because their alignment, the brand is unaligned all the way around. It's unaligned for what the company stands for. It's unaligned with how it presents itself. It's unaligned with how the employees, the expectations that the companies have for their employees. And so all of these things are now coming together, and guess what? It's time to address them, because in this year, it is really a point where people are less patient than they used to be, and for good reason.
Definitely. You know, I think there's been a couple interesting examples that I've seen real recently, working a lot in the social media space. One of the large social media management platforms, and this has been fairly public, had engaged in a contract with ICE, Immigration Services, and had a strong reaction, both first internally from their employees. They said that, among the Slack channels and things within the company, there was a strong sort of negative reaction to this engagement with ICE. And then that bubbled over into external and social media, where there was a number of threads on Twitter and other places from employees talking about how they were uncomfortable working for a company that had these things. And in that case, Hootsuite, the brand, took a step back and decided that they were going to step away from that client, and decided to go forward, and that they, I don't know if you want to say listen to their employees or acquiesce to their employees, but I think that is one, sort of one way that you can look at it. It's like, okay, this is a way that employees can make their voices known, both internally and externally, put some pressure on their employers to do things that align more with their brand. But I think for a lot of companies, that starts to feel fairly uncomfortable, right? We're like, wait a minute, we worked really hard to get this deal. We've decided, that based on our own ethics and morals or whatever of the company, that we are going to go through with this. Maybe some of the people aren't going to like it, but we want to do it. So, sort of as a company, and I know that there's, been more examples, people outside of Bezos' house and other things going on. What do you think, how do you respond to that? Is there a way? There's another recent example, I think, that Douglas, that you had been looking at, which was Coinbase try to come out and say, no, everybody be quiet, shut up, we don't want you talking about anything. And that doesn't feel right to me either.
Yeah, that's to me blew me away. The CEO of Coinbase announced that going forward there would be no discussion of politics and no discussion of social issues. And instead, the way he positioned it is, we are going to focus exclusively on our mission. And then he goes into what the company's mission is. But I'm sorry, I don't think that, well, I won't say my opinion any more than I just did. I think that was it certainly caught the attention. There was a huge discussion on it on Twitter. A lot of people applauded it. A lot of people thought it was irresponsible, or at best naive to think that you could actually do that. And so, right, and to say to your employees, all right, you're not going to talk about anything that's important to you unless it aligns with what we do as a company.
Right. And what they, my understanding is they said, we don't get into policy, we don't get into politics. And Adria, I think there is another poll question here about, do you agree with Coinbase? And I think it's interesting that even if you were to try to say, okay, we as a company are not going to take any stand on any issue, I mean, that this year more than ever is, I think, in many ways, taking a stand, right? And you can't be silent. And I think with Coinbase, my understanding was that a lot of this came from them initially deciding not to respond to any of the, George Floyd and many other people in the Black Lives Matter movement, and to make a statement saying that Black Lives Matter until, and this is just things I've read, from the employees on Twitter, until a large number of the people actually walked out, their developers walked out. And then what was seen as a largely, just attempted conciliatory statement was made by them. And that now this request that we're just going to be completely agnostic, sort of arose out of the desire not to get into politics. But yeah, I think even if you agree that it's something that's possible, or something that you'd want to do, it just, I agree, it seems impossible to expect that employees would not be out doing things.
Right, and I think the people on this webinar agree. 57% said no, they don't agree, and then understandably 43 said they're not familiar, and good for them for not making a decision without enough information. But I think it is naive and actually disingenuous and somewhat immature to think that you can separate issues like human decency from everything else you do. I mean, you could argue that a type of tax cut is a political decision, but standing up for human life is not a political stance. It is right or wrong. And if you think that you're going to be able to have a contribution to the world, if you just focus on one little bit of it, then yeah, it's not going to work, because nobody's going to follow you. No one's going to believe you. No one's going to feel anything for you. And that's one of the things that brands are really supposed to do and really do well, is they make you feel something. Because people make decisions to buy something or to do anything based on emotion, and they use facts to justify their decision. So if they don't feel anything for what you're doing, they're not going to work with you. And that's why brands are so important. And that's why I used to have a woman boss who used to say, put on your big boy pants and make a decision. And you have to do that. You have to make a decision about who you are as a brand and what's important to you. And I think that, again, the expectations from consumers overwhelmingly says that they want to work with companies that stand for something. And look at Starbucks and its great success as a brand. A lot of their customers don't necessarily agree with everything that they put forth, but they respect the fact that they are out there with an opinion. And I think this example is just going to come back and bite them in a not so happy place at some point.
Yeah, I think that for consumer brands, it seems more obvious to me for large consumer brands or restaurants, which have been, kind of all over this. But I think for B2B brands, a company, there's tons of huge B2B brands. I won't try to name any, but you're a large global corporation. It's very difficult to take kind of any stance, that's not going to potentially offend, some aspect of your potential customer base. And you might not be, a company that is immediately recognizable to the public. Is it still important for like that kind of company to be taking a stand on these sorts of issues? And I guess I'll offer my opinion first. I think it is for employees, right? To let your employees know that these social issues are important to you. But in terms of external communications, I just wonder. I'll make maybe the devil's advocate argument of like, hey, we've been not commenting on social and political issues, and we expect our employees to kind of do the same, or at least the employees who have a voice out there for 150 years, and we'd like to continue doing that, Douglas. Why shouldn't we?
Right. Well, it's an interesting fact. I think this is also part of the climate today, that we no longer are comfortable with dissenting opinions, and so you might be able to have an opinion and still command the respect of other people, but now we don't give each other a minute. If someone doesn't agree with us, then we automatically write them off. So in this climate, you could argue that it's even more important not to take a stance in that context. But to your point earlier, I think that it is, you're not going to attract the best and brightest talent. And you're not going to, and if you don't encourage, oh God, I read this thing that was really, it's really interesting, that if your culture is about open discussion and about questioning, you can't have that inside. You can't have a culture inside where, we should question things, and we should be open about what we're thinking, and then have a completely opposite culture on the outside. So if you have a different culture on the outside and then you have there's going to be a huge disconnect, and that's going to create dissonance that does, and it's been proven, impact your bottom line. So you've got to be consistent with how you approach the world. If anybody's ever heard me talk before, they've heard me say this, and I apologize, you're gonna roll your eyes if you've heard it, but there's this great club in Boston many, many years ago, and in the lobby it said, dress code, know who you are and dress accordingly. And that is so true when it comes to brands. Brands have to know who they are, and they have to present themselves accordingly. And it's all about authenticity. Authenticity is more important than ever because we are so good at sniffing out inauthenticity these days. And so it is more important than ever.
Yeah, no, I think that level of integrity of being the same on the inside and outside for companies is highly important. One of the things here in Minneapolis that we've been seeing a lot of recently, and I think it's great in some ways, and it has been showing sides of companies that I wasn't aware of in others. A lot of our local tap rooms and microbreweries have been unionizing. Mm-hmm. And it's not something that, I think a lot of people had talked about in this specific kind of instance, but as like one of the local ones here, actually in my neighborhood that's very successful, has a great place. When COVID hit, they were one of the businesses that quickly switched over to making hand sanitizer, and they were doing a lot of things that I think externally looked like, all right, this is a company that's doing well. This small brewery that's been growing and becoming more popular, and then they had a request from their employees to form a union, and they had the option of either automatically accepting the union or going through some other steps and kind of trying to maybe not accept the union. And they instead shut down their whole dining hall and restaurant the next day. And that was, potentially for other reasons. But they went from having, I think, a very, very high brand affinity level to a very negative one, at least among a large segment of their customer base here in in the middle of the city in Minneapolis. I'm sure there was some people who was like, yeah, keep the union down, and now they want to go buy them. But it was like one of the fastest, among the people I know, like one of the fastest changes when employees started coming out and saying, hey, actually, this is how things are going. This is how we've been, treated. All of that had, maybe there was some corners of social media where those kind of discussions among employees were already happening. But for the vast number of the members of the public, this brand had been putting on a very good, communications program. And I think doing a lot of good stuff. I don't want to say it's just communications program, but it was sort of this one spot where their armor was weak or whatever. And they made this decision to take this action against this union organization. And suddenly it was just this flood of all of the things that maybe, were sort of overlooked or not cared about. And, the brand affinity that I've seen just, took a huge dive. Now, obviously, you want to say that any kind of time that employers are trying to frame or restrict employee speech around union activities or other kind of workplace conditions, can't do that at all. But let's say, when you don't align, when the employees are actually specifically calling out the brand, that I think that was another one of our poll questions. That have anyone on this in the webinar here ever called out their
Ever wanted to
and call out their employer on social media?
And while we're waiting for those results, I think you brought up an interesting point, and that is that years ago when we had when companies had the policy of we don't comment on issues, employees didn't really have an audience to share their frustrations. Yeah, they could go home and share with their families. Oh my God, my company did this and it really annoys me. Well, okay, what's the family going to do? But now with social media, employees have this audience where they can share that information. So it really wasn't a question before because there was nobody there to listen to the employees. And now there are plenty of people to listen. And so the approach of we can't let employees talk is outdated, and it just doesn't work in this world anymore. Did we get those results yet? Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, yeah, I think that these conversations that used to just happening at Thanksgiving dinner between different people are now very, very public, and the conversation is going to happen either way. So we have the results here. Host sharing poll results. Have you ever wanted to publicly call out your employer on social media? 60% say no. 40% say yes. I'm self-employed and I'm certainly one to call out my employer on social media. But I think that that's still a pretty, considering the audience that we probably have on the webinar, that's still a pretty high percentage to have, 40% of the people who have wanted to call out their employer on social media around something they've done.
So I was just going to say, so I saw the stat that said from Herbert Smith Freehills law firm, 95% of companies that they surveyed expect a rise in the number of employees using social media to raise complaints and concerns about their employer. 95% of companies expect this. So what do they need to do?
Yeah, I think that's, where we are now. What can you do to, as a company, other than being a good company who has a lot of integrity, who does the right things already, but as far as practices that maybe a communications team or a brand team or an HR team can undertake, what are some of those governance steps that you can put in? And I think that, first of all, if you have a culture in which that sort of feedback is not welcome internally, it's going to bubble out externally. Mm-hmm. So, it might be uncomfortable to have those, Slack channels or whatever they might be. I know that they were talking about how I think Facebook had shut down some internal Slack channels that were, Facebook uses Slack, that employees were using to give negative feedback, right? And it's like, no, we don't want to hear this negative feedback here. And so shut them down. But that doesn't change the feelings of the employees. And if anything, right, is going to increase the employees' desire to air their grievances against the company. So I think that is one, really important step, is like, if you're not willing to listen to it here, you're going to have to listen to it, possibly on the news or in TechCrunch or wherever, wherever that might be. So doing those sorts of things. The other thing that I found was really important was how you train employees. I think that there is this idea of employees just not even realizing that they might go out there, they might have a strongly held political belief, or they might just, be out spouting off, let's say, about some political issue. And it might not even occur to them that this is ever going to be associated with their employer, right? Mm-hmm. And I do think that employees should, feel free to express themselves in any way that they feel comfortable and appropriate on their personal social media accounts. But they should be aware that that is going to potentially reflect on their employer. And in some cases, that can have negative, consequences for them in one way or another. Mm. But I think like that level of awareness by employees, oh, I should think about this, because even if I'm not a spokesperson for my company, I might do something that that reflects poorly on the company, because it's very easy to find out where someone works nowadays. You just kind of track them down on LinkedIn. Right. So rather than just telling employees to do nothing, putting that sort of training in place that will help employees to understand that, hey, people are 2 clicks away from seeing, where you work and who your boss is, right? So if you're online, just be aware of that, and treat people like you would in real life. Ideally, assuming that you treat people better in real life than you would.
Right. Well, employers can't have it both ways. On one hand, we can't have employee advocacy where employers say, oh, it'd be really great if you help us out and share this great content with your networks, and then say, oh, but don't tell anybody where you work. That's just literally impossible. Right. And so companies also have to, and I agree that you have to have the train in place to help employees put everything in perspective, but they also have to have a game plan to approach different scenario when they happen. What are some of those scenarios that they can? How would you recommend to a client that they set themselves up for preparing for these situations?
Yeah, I think not just having the policy, but also making sure that the policy is helpful and that people are aware of it. Having the policy hidden back somewhere isn't going to particularly suit anyone, even if you can come back and say, well, you violated the policy. Ideally, a social media policy should be less about being the enforcer, and more about showing you where those areas of sort of safe space are, where those guardrails are that people can operate in. Say, hey, if you're going to talk about our company, here's the ways that we'd like you to talk about it. And I think having that in place is great, because there really is not a great recourse after the fact. I mean, even if you go and fire the employee, which isn't what I'm recommending at all, that's not going to help your brand reputation that might be harmed by what an employee does. All of the opportunity is in front of that, right? By training employees and by showing them what to do, by providing good examples of how they can engage. And I think just making them aware of the risk, if that's useful to them.
And I think that it's also important to remember that you do have to give employees a channel to talk about and express what they're thinking. It's not just about having a policy one way that, all right, this is what you can and can't do. If you don't want to read about what your employees think about you on Twitter, then give them a channel internally to share information. So, your reference about Facebook was surprising, because, if you don't have internal conversations about important issues, they are going to leak out, and they are going to find themselves in the media, or at least in the social media. And one other thing that I want to bring up is that just because employees might activism might act out against you, doesn't mean you automatically have to do exactly what they want. The key is you've got to listen to them, and you've got to give them an opportunity to talk about what it is they feel they're fired up about. And and resist the urge to explain yourself right away. You've just got to give them a chance to provide their point of view. And then consider that point of view. There's an example, I'm in Boston, and sometime in the last 2 years, Wayfair is based here. Wayfair employees did a walkout because Wayfair was selling furnishings for use in the immigration camps, at the Mexican border. And Wayfair did not change their policy, but they listened, and then they had a response that took into consideration, that acknowledged what the employees were saying, but they said, but we are still going to go ahead and here are the reasons why. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for keeping us, we will, and I think genuine content that was meant to say, all right, we hear you. We're not going to do exactly what you want, but we understand where you're coming from. And so just by saying that, just when we tell companies that they have to listen, they have to listen to their employees, we're not saying they have to do whatever the employees say. We have to, what we're saying, I think, what I'm saying, I don't want to speak for you, what I'm saying is they have to listen and have a legit conversation.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think that, that is sort of the role of the communications team or just senior management, is coming in and, respecting employees' opinions and understanding that people do want to have more alignment than just a paycheck with their employers oftentimes. And as you mentioned earlier, millennials are choosing, and hopefully many of us are choosing our employers to some degree based on how we feel about them as they, engage in.
I thought you were a millennial.
I don't think so. I'm Gen X. No. Yeah, I don't know how to use TikTok or anything, but no. And I think that, by having that sort of expectation when they go in, to be able to carry through and have a company say, hey, we hear you. Here's why we're doing what we're doing. We'd love to hear your feedback on it. Is going to result in much better sort of any kind of external mentions or discussions that might come from employees.
Right.
Is in a much better place if it's coming from, hey, we don't totally agree with what the company's doing. We understand it. You might choose to leave, but they've explained at least their position to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So, Adria, do we have any questions yet?
Let me see. Not yet, but if anyone wants to submit any, you can go to the Q&A section on the bottom of your screen and type it in. Yes, please do. So Casey, here's a hypothetical scenario. Let's say that someone doesn't go out, goes on social media and doesn't say anything against their company, but they say something against some other company, and they end up insulting a very powerful client of their own company. So, they're out sharing their own opinion about something in the marketplace in which they are in which they're engaged, and unknowingly insult someone that spends money with their employer. The client says, your employee, you got to get him or her in line, or else I'm gonna leave. What does a company do? Yeah, right. So, I mean, you have that probably hopefully coming into the communications team that, hey, one of our customers has said that one of our employees insulted them online. So, I think my initial reaction would, first of all, after you've helped the customer to understand that doesn't reflect what the company wants to do, what recourse do you have with that employee? If they were acting outside of the scope of their work, and this was just like a political discussion on Facebook or something, what I've found is that as much as I, coming from sort of this either communications or social media point of view, would love to sit down with that employee or have the manager of that employee during their regularly scheduled biweekly one-on-one say, hey, I want to make you aware of our social media policies and how we reflect the brand, and to understand that even if you are
you know, not realizing that you're talking on behalf of the company, there's a chance that you might be talking to one of our customers. However, human resources in their role to often protect employees says, hey, this is not something that they were doing within the scope of their work. They were using their own personal social media channels. They were never expressing, even though it was obvious from their social media page that they work for us. They were never expressing this to be the views of the company. So we are not even going to let their manager talk to them about this, and we're going to do nothing, which I also completely understand from that point of view, but it makes it very difficult. And that's why I think that getting in front of those kinds of conversations with that policy and with that training beforehand is really important. And why I think that it's a little bit counterintuitive, but this idea that activating your employees on social media is going to make this more likely to happen, that you're going to have this negative outcome, I think is very common and may be right, but I disagree with it. I think that actually having the time to go to train your employees on how to use social media and encourage them social media is more likely to reduce the number of times that they go out and do something dumb or do something you wouldn't want them to do, because that they're going to do anyway. But if you're talking to them first and giving them some instruction, there might be seemingly more opportunities for that to happen, but less likelihood that it would happen because you have actually given them some affirmative instructions and not just told them what not to do, but told them what you would like them to do, which from all the books that I've skimmed on child rearing and dog rearing is the way that you're supposed to approach these things.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think it also goes to the point that employees are going to be far less likely to lash out at an employer whom they believe values them. And if you spend time and really lead employees through your thinking around something, whether that's social media or any decision, they're going to feel more valued legitimately. I'm not suggesting people do that just to say, there, you feel valued, don't you? Don't you feel valued? But to genuinely create a culture in which employees feel valued, and to your point, giving them background on how to effectively use social media without restraining them is a way to make employees feel valued and make them feel like a partner in the business, and thereby they'll be less likely to do harm to the business.
Yeah, I think that has been throughout my employee advocacy, social selling, executive activation, whatever it might be. You got to train your employees and trust your employees, right? Because you also need to have a lot of good monitoring, but all the monitoring in the world is not going to keep up with having employees that have been well trained and that you trust. And that if you don't trust them, that is going to shine through as well and is going to have the opposite effect of what you're going for.
Hey, you just said something, executive training, and I would love to get your take on what do you do in a situation where your C-suite just doesn't get it?
Yeah, that's a huge challenge. I think that sometimes you realize that you're not going to be able to convince much or any of the C-suite. And so you start to look for other people who can be advocates for this sort of thing. I have also found that when I work with companies that are looking to activate employees or looking to give employees a voice, there is some value in maybe moving it forward in a very small piloted way to make the case so that you can then instruct sort of the C-suite how it works. But a lot of times it just comes down to having case studies showing what, similarly situated companies just went through this situation. There's a likelihood that we'll go through it too, or at least a possibility, and pointing that out to them. But usually you have to demonstrate that the risk is very real. And either it's happened to you already and the C-suite just isn't aware of it, or you can show that it's happened to other places and that they have to get on it. Being able to demonstrate that, we're going to have some, potential uptick in brand affinity if we do this big program, but it's going to create some risk. While I think it's true, isn't as effective as a couple of slides showing like headlines that, some other company hopefully is making that you never want to have to make yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think there's also data that could be very helpful. Employee employee surveys around their attitude towards towards these kind of issues. When the economy gets better, and it will, retaining the best talent is going to be a challenge, and you're going to have a culture that people are going to want to stay at. And that is a huge risk that companies need to think about, even in downturned economies.
Yeah.
You know, I think the other thing that you guys have mentioned, in addition to training, and Douglas, you mentioned it earlier, was about silos, and not just how we think about reputation in silos, but the need that social media has generated within organizations for the organizational silos to be broken down, right? And we've all seen this both in our, work that we did together, as well as work we've done with clients, is that so often the social media team, which is under-resourced and sometimes not understood by the C-suite, is an afterthought, right? And what we've seen is that there has to be a real coordinated, collaborative effort between social media, internal communications, external communications, marketing, brand, public relations, and a real effort to educate the C-suite on the importance of all of these functions working together, right? I mean, we've done this through a digital center of excellence, training, enablement, governance, but the idea of somebody putting something internally, like you were mentioning, Casey, and we know that can go external, right? Either through a screenshot or somebody just taking that conversation offline, off the internal channel and putting it external. It's changed the nature of how internal communications have to be written, with that idea that everything can always go external. Having legal involved, to what you said, Casey, is that, you can't tell people that they can't talk about their workplace. It's not just a bad idea, it's illegal, right? So having organizations understand that it's actually illegal to do that, and you can be sued for that. And then, I always wonder about when we see numbers like that about a minority of organizations having a social media policy, or is that true? Or is there a policy that nobody knows about because there's been no training and enablement effort?
Right.
And we've seen that too, right? There's a policy, but nobody knows about it because it's sitting somewhere. So I know
the company has lawyers, they have a policy somewhere.
Yeah. And that actually brings us to a couple of the Q&As that people sent in. Christine, thanks for sending this one. Talking about having a smaller marketing team, are there templates to help build a social media policy? And there certainly are.
As a matter of fact, we have them.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think Jen probably has some insights on that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we do, and we actually do together with our clients. We have a template that we offer to our clients as a starting point. Douglas and I actually wrote it together for one of our clients, and it's just a jumping off point. There are some things that have to be in there from a legal perspective, but to Douglas's point, you want your policy to reflect who you are, right? Mm-hmm. If you have a code of conduct, referring back to that right from the start is just great, because you do want your employees to act the same online or offline. So if you have a code of conduct, expectations that you have for your employees, that's your starting place. And that makes it really easy for the lawyers then, because theoretically your employees have signed off on that code of conduct, and that's how they conduct themselves wherever they are. So that's a good starting place. You want the voice to be something that is in your organization's tone of voice, so that when they're reading it, they just don't feel like they're reading a legal document. They can really align themselves with that. You want it to be short, and you want it to be understandable. And then of course you want to back it up with training. So that's all stuff that we help our clients do all the time.
All right.
So go ahead.
Oh, I was going to move on to the next question, Douglas. So go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to do the same thing. So do you think employers should compensate employees for pro-company social media activity? I think the word compensate is problematic. I think reward is different. I think you can use rewards and gamification to encourage people to participate in your program. But when you start compensating, and there might even be legal issues associated with this, but to start compensating people to promote your work is problematic, because it makes it less genuine. And again, authenticity is really important. But the other thing is, the messaging should be, okay, you're already getting compensated for this. The better the company does, the better you do. And so if you can help the company do better through social media, then you will in some way be compensated. But I do think there are plenty of options for rewarding and encouraging employees to be involved in social media activity.
And employees will do that on their own if they are proud of the organization.
Yes.
Right? So
Yeah.
we know that FedEx, we actually did a case study with FedEx a couple of years ago where they didn't have an employee advocacy program, but once they started monitoring employee use of social media, what they saw was that on those days when FedEx was paying their employees to go out into the community and volunteer and do those employee volunteer days, on their own, FedEx employees were so proud to work for a company that supported their community in that way and gave them that opportunity, that they were posting stuff on social media. And so that was the jumping off point for FedEx to actually create a hashtag and operationalize that and have that be the beginning of their employee advocacy program, because there was genuine interest on behalf of employees to talk about how great their company was. So I think look for those moments rather than trying to encourage your employees through some kind of artificial. I mean, it's amazing what employees will do for badges on their intranet, but I've always found it quite stunning. But I think the better thing for the employee, for the brand, for employee engagement is to find those moments where employees want to talk about their employer and how great it is. I remember that at Thomson Reuters, we had a lot of activity around gay pride parades, marriage rights, and all those days that whether it was advocating for marriage rights in Minnesota or the parades in New York or San Francisco or London that we would sponsor, is that those were some of the days when our employees were just emotionally so happy to work for a company that supported equality, and so look for those moments in your organization that can genuinely inspire.
I totally agree. I think that there are some trickier issues, particularly for companies that have a lot of hourly employees. If they are expected to be doing, or even encouraged to do things that are on social media on behalf of their employer after hours, that raises a very complicated set of issues. It's very important from a compliance from a compliance standpoint, that if employees are doing things that, and the way that I talk about it is, if you're talking about our company in a way that you wouldn't have thought of talking about our company if you didn't work here, you have to disclose that you work here in that messaging. So you can't just say, hey, I love, the widgets from Lumberjack Social, those are awesome, without saying, oh, by the way, I liked it so much that I got a job there. So, there's some really specific kind of, I think, challenges around how you compensate employees and what is compensatable time. But I think that, from Jen's point, the idea that you are providing this almost as a service to employees to help them to develop themselves professionally, gain greater authority, trying to switch that around a little bit instead of saying, hey, we're going to give you, gamification works wonderfully, but I hate it in many ways. Like what people do for badges just doesn't make any sense to me. But if you can get people to realize and find a way that this is going to help them to become more employable, both inside and outside the company. If you're going to help the employees to say, hey, I got 25 new people who are following me on LinkedIn now, and I feel like I'm more excited about the kind of work that I do because now I have this greater audience. That's what you want to go for. But there's some really tricky issues about like what you do about hourly employees who might not be sitting at a computer, or what you do when people start to talk in a way that doesn't make it as clear as it should be, that they actually are getting paid to say this, because they wouldn't be doing it if they weren't getting.
Right. Slippery slope.
Yeah, and that's all stuff we put into that template so that folks, know they're covered with all the legalities of the ins and outs of this, because it's not self-evident, right? And these laws have been evolving, and so there's definitely that piece of it, is wanting to make sure that you are enabling your employees to do the right thing. Because if they don't know what to do, most employees don't want to do something that's going to harm their employers, right? So they're more likely to do nothing, even if you want them to, if they're not sure what they're supposed to do.
They might want to harm their boss, but not their employer.
I think we're almost out of time, but I want to make sure, and Douglas, ask you, like, as you are, focusing more and more on companies who have purpose, how does that, it seems like a huge opportunity there, right? To empower employees to align with that purpose. But I also see that it could be, challenging for companies to move from a place where they weren't primarily a purpose-driven company, or, if employers come in and that wasn't sort of what they signed up for. So I just wanted to kind of get that take. 'Cause I think that the idea that more companies or more people are thinking about starting companies or organizations that have a purpose beyond just, satisfying shareholders financially. Right. How does that work with how you either support or align or train employees on the way they talk about a company? Because I think that is ideally should be a great opportunity, right?
It should be. And I think it goes to kind of a question I threw at you, and that's around leadership. You've got to have leadership. It's called leadership for a reason. People lead others from one point to another. And so if senior leadership is excited about a new direction, then it's up to them to engage people and bring them along. Now, the example we just shared earlier at the beginning of the call, I'm blanking,
Coinbase.
Yes.
Their CEO said, and if you don't agree with this, we will give you 6 months severance. And so even though I don't agree with the policy, I think that was a really smart way to approach that level of change. So this is who we are. We hope you agree. If you don't, no harm, no foul. Have a great life, and we'll help you move on. And so I think there's those are the two things that come to mind when I think about how do you move a culture through from one point to another. And I think explaining the why is always important in every single situation. Why are you doing something? Why are you doing it now? Why is it important for everyone? And that will go such a long way in bringing people along with you.
I think that's great advice, not just for a purpose-driven company, but for life. This is who we are. This is what I do. I'd love it if you joined us. If you don't, best of luck and have a good life. It seems like advice I could probably carry into a lot of parts of my life.
On that note, Douglas and Casey, thank you so much. I think this was, I hope it was as valuable and interesting to everyone as it was to me. I feel really privileged to be working with you guys in this new environment as we did previously. For those of you who are on the line who are not familiar with who we are, as I said, Casey and Douglas are both member consultants of Consultants Collective. They are two of more than 30 of our member consultants around the world. We provide a new approach to management consulting. So in addition to communications and digital and social media, we have advisors, coaches, and executive consultants who have been executives at world-class organizations across a span of many industries and many functions, human capital, technology, legal, finance, and of course, communications and marketing and sales. And so we get in there and we really partner with our clients. We can offer a peer-based approach because we have been in your shoes and we understand how tough a lot of these issues are that we talk about today, as well as the many issues that leaders are facing today. We were very honored to be named a Power Player by Business Insider earlier this year as part of its list of the top disruptors in management consulting. And we are one of those mission-driven organizations that Douglas talks about. We are very focused on results for our clients, but we are driven by mission, purpose, and values. And we try to bring that love of what we do and making the world a better place through the organizations that we serve. So if we can help you, reach out. In the meantime, we will be sending you an email with a link to the recording. This will be on our digital media and learning platform, Biznology. Feel free to share it with your colleagues. and let us know if you have any questions. And I hope you all have a great day, a great weekend, and stay healthy and well. And Douglas and Casey and Adria, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Take care.
Take care.